I need to start with something I don't think I've said clearly enough before. I was wrong about cardio, but not in the way I've corrected myself in previous videos. I've told you that strength predicts longevity more powerfully than cardio. I've told you that zone 2 training isn't the singular foundation I once presented it as, and that a polarized mix of lower and higher intensity work beats either extreme. Both of those corrections still hold up, but there's a piece I kept dancing around without ever naming directly, and I think it's actually the single most important variable in this entire conversation, more important than which specific training method you use, more important than the zone 2 versus interval debate, more important, arguably, than most of what gets discussed in popular fitness content about cardio and lifespan. That variable is VO2 max itself, your body's actual measured maximal capacity to take in and use oxygen. And I don't think I've ever fully sat you down and explained why this single number matters as much as it does, independent of how you got there. I want to fix that today, and I want to go deep because I think once you understand what VO2 max actually represents physiologically, a lot of the surrounding debates about training method start to look like arguments about the paint color on a house whose foundation is the thing that actually determines whether it stays standing. Let me start with the number itself, and I want you to really sit with this rather than let it wash over you the way statistics tend to in a video like this. A large study published in JAMA examined cardiorespiratory fitness across a huge cohort of adults and found that low cardiorespiratory fitness was associated with a mortality risk comparable to, or in some analyses, exceeding some of the most feared, most heavily treated risk factors in all of medicine: smoking, diabetes, existing cardiovascular disease, citation, JAMA, 2018, cardiorespiratory fitness and long-term mortality research. Let that sit for a second. Not associated with a modestly elevated risk, comparable to or exceeding smoking. We treat smoking as one of the most catastrophic, avoidable risk factors a person can carry. And here's a number: sitting quietly in your own physiology that in this research carried a similar or larger weight, and almost nobody gets it measured. Almost nobody talks about it the way they talk about their cholesterol or their blood pressure. I want to walk through what VO2 max actually is physiologically before we go any further, because I think a lot of people have heard the term without really understanding what it represents inside the body. VO2 max is the maximum rate at which your body can take in, transport, and use oxygen during intense physical effort, and it depends on the coordinated function of multiple systems working together: your lungs and their capacity to move air and exchange oxygen into the bloodstream, your heart's capacity to pump oxygenated blood, specifically your stroke volume, the amount of blood ejected with each heartbeat, your blood's actual oxygen carrying capacity, and at the very end of that chain, your muscle's capacity to actually extract and use that oxygen once it arrives, largely determined by mitochondrial density and function within the muscle tissue itself. Citation. This integrated multi-system physiological basis of VO2 max is foundational exercise physiology, described extensively in textbooks and review literature on cardiopulmonary exercise testing. This is really the key insight I want you to walk away with early in this video. VO2 max isn't measuring one thing. It's measuring the integrated output of your entire oxygen delivery and utilization system operating at its absolute ceiling, which is precisely why it captures so much predictive information in a single number. If you want to actually go deep on the full research behind everything I'm covering across this entire series, including how VO2 max fits together with the strength and longevity conversation we've had in previous videos, I put together a couple of ebooks that walk through this in a lot more structured detail than I can cover here. They're linked down in the description below. And if you've been following along with these videos and actually want a complete, organized reference to come back to, rather than trying to piece it together across a dozen separate videos, I genuinely encourage you to go check them out. Let's talk about why this integrated measurement carries such disproportionate predictive weight compared to almost any other single health marker we routinely check. Think about everything that has to go right for you to achieve a high VO2 max. Your heart has to be structurally healthy and efficient, capable of a large stroke volume, rather than compensating for a weak, inefficient pump through a rapid heart rate alone. Your lungs have to be functioning well without significant obstruction or restriction, limiting oxygen exchange. Your blood has to be carrying adequate hemoglobin, meaning you're not anemic or otherwise compromised in oxygen carrying capacity. Your vascular system has to be healthy enough to actually deliver that oxygenated blood efficiently to working tissue, meaning your arteries aren't stiff or narrowed by atherosclerotic disease. And your muscle tissue itself has to have adequate mitochondrial density, meaning you have sufficient of the actual cellular machinery capable of using that oxygen to produce energy. A low VO2 max can be a symptom of a problem in any one or several of these systems simultaneously, which is precisely why it functions as such a remarkably sensitive, integrated marker of overall physiological health, rather than a narrow single system measurement the way something like blood pressure or cholesterol represents. I think this is genuinely the piece that reframes the entire cardio conversation for me. When I was previously debating Zone 2 against interval training, I was implicitly treating the training method as the primary variable that mattered. What I've come to understand more clearly is that the training method is really just a tool, a means to an end, and the end, the actual thing that predicts whether you live longer and stay functionally capable while you're alive, is this integrated measurement of your oxygen delivery and utilization system's sealing capacity. Different training methods can get you to a similar VO2 max through somewhat different physiological pathways, but it's the destination, your actual measured or estimated VO2 max, that the mortality data most directly and most powerfully implicates, not the specific route you took to get there. Let's look at the dose-response relationship here, because I think this is genuinely one of the more striking pieces of this entire body of research. Research examining cardiorespiratory fitness and mortality has consistently found that the relationship isn't linear. It's considerably steeper at the lower end of the fitness distribution, meaning the difference in mortality risk between someone in the lowest fitness category and someone in the next lowest category is dramatically larger than the difference between someone in a high fitness category and someone in an even higher one. Citation: this dose-response curve for cardiorespiratory fitness and mortality has been described across multiple large cohort studies published in Mayo Clinic proceedings. Some research examining this relationship across a large clinical population found that individuals in the lowest fitness category had a mortality risk multiple times higher than those in the highest fitness category, with the largest single jump in risk reduction occurring specifically between the very lowest fitness group and the group immediately above it. Citation: this specific magnitude of mortality risk difference across fitness categories, with particular emphasis on the steep risk reduction moving out of the lowest category, has been examined in cardiopulmonary exercise testing research published in Mayo Clinic proceedings, tracking large clinical populations undergoing exercise stress testing. This has a genuinely important practical implication that I think gets lost in a lot of fitness content aimed at people who are already reasonably active. If you're currently in that lowest fitness category, meaning you're largely sedentary or minimally active, the single most impactful thing you can do for your long-term mortality risk isn't optimizing between Zone 2 and intervals. It's simply becoming active enough to move out of that bottom category in the first place. The marginal gain from that specific transition dwarfs almost any other fitness optimization decision you could make. This is genuinely liberating information if you're someone who's felt overwhelmed by the amount of nuanced, competing advice in the fitness space. The research is telling you quite clearly that the biggest lever by far is simply not being in the lowest fitness category. And everything else we're going to discuss in this video matters considerably less by comparison, though it still matters. For those of you who are already reasonably active and are thinking about this more at the margins, let's talk about what actually determines VO2 max improvement. And this is where I want to bring back the training method conversation, but now properly subordinated to VO2 max as the actual target, rather than treating training method as the primary thing we're debating. Multiple meta-analyses comparing high-intensity interval training against moderate-intensity continuous training have found that interval training tends to produce larger improvements in VO2 max per unit of training time. Citation: this comparative efficiency has been demonstrated across multiple meta-analyses published in Sports Medicine examining high-intensity interval training versus moderate-intensity continuous training for cardiorespiratory fitness improvement. I've discussed this before, but I want to frame it slightly differently here. Given everything we've just covered about VO2 max being the actual target rather than any specific training zone being an end in itself, if VO2 max is genuinely the outcome that most directly predicts your mortality risk, and interval training is a demonstrably efficient tool for improving that specific outcome, then the practical implication becomes considerably clearer than when this was framed purely as a zone 2 versus interval debate in isolation. Interval training deserves a meaningful place in your training simply because of how directly and efficiently it moves the specific needle that the mortality data cares about most. I don't want to lose the nuance from our previous conversation entirely, though, because I think it still matters here. Polarized training, combining a large volume of lower intensity work with a smaller, deliberate dose of higher intensity effort, has generally been found to produce superior overall fitness outcomes compared to either extreme alone. Citation: this polarized training research has primarily been conducted in endurance athlete populations and has been examined in sports medicine reviews on training intensity distribution. What I want to add to this conversation now, with VO2 max properly centered as the actual target, is that the reason polarized training likely outperforms pure zone 2 isn't simply because variety is good in some vague sense. It's more specifically because the higher intensity component of a polarized approach directly challenges and expands your maximal aerobic ceiling in a way that submaximal, moderate intensity work alone doesn't accomplish nearly as efficiently, while the lower intensity base provides the volume and sustainability needed to accumulate meaningful total training load without excessive injury or burnout risk. Let me bring in something I think deserves more direct attention than I've given it before, which is what specifically happens physiologically when you push training intensity up toward your actual maximal effort, and why this specifically drives VO2 max improvement more effectively than submaximal work. Improvements in VO2 max come from adaptations across the entire oxygen delivery chain we discussed earlier, but the cardiac adaptation specifically increases in stroke volume. The amount of blood your heart pumps with each beat appears to respond particularly strongly to training performed at or near your actual maximal heart rate and cardiac output, essentially forcing your heart to adapt to handle the highest possible demand you can generate. Citation: this relationship between near maximal intensity training and cardiac stroke volume adaptations has been examined in cardiovascular exercise physiology research published in journals, including the Journal of Applied Physiology. Training that never approaches this maximal demand, however consistently and sustainably it's performed, simply doesn't provide the same specific stimulus to drive this particular adaptation as effectively, which helps explain, at a mechanistic level, why interval training tends to outperform purely submaximal training for VO2, max improvement specifically, even when total training volume and time investment are accounted for. I want to spend some time now addressing something that I think has been an honest blind spot in how I've previously discussed this topic, which is the question of measuring your own VO2 max in the first place. Because I think a huge amount of the value in this entire conversation gets lost if you never actually know your own number and are simply guessing at whether your training is moving it in the right direction. The gold standard method for measuring VO2 max directly is a laboratory-based graded exercise test, sometimes called a cardiopulmonary exercise test, where you exercise at progressively increasing intensity while wearing a mask that measures your actual oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production in real time, continuing until you reach genuine volitional exhaustion. Citation: this direct measurement methodology for VO2 max via graded exercise testing with metabolic gas analysis is the established gold standard in exercise physiology, described extensively in cardiopulmonary exercise testing literature. This kind of testing has historically been available primarily through specialized exercise physiology, labs, university research facilities, or certain sports medicine clinics. And while it's become somewhat more accessible in recent years through commercial fitness testing services in some major cities, it still isn't something the average person has convenient, low-cost access to. Given that direct laboratory testing isn't accessible for most people, let's talk about the estimation methods that are more widely available, because I think understanding both their usefulness and their real limitations matters for how much confidence you should place in the numbers you're likely to encounter. Consumer wearable devices increasingly offer VO₂ max estimates, generally derived from algorithms combining your heart rate response during exercise, your pace or power output, and sometimes additional data like heart rate variability, and validation research comparing these device estimates against actual laboratory measured VO₂ max has found reasonably good correlation for some devices in some populations, though with meaningful individual variation in accuracy and generally somewhat better performance in more consistently active, fitter individuals compared to sedentary or highly deconditioned populations, where the underlying algorithms tend to have less reliable training data to draw from citation, this validation research on consumer wearable. VO₂ max estimation accuracy compared to laboratory gold standard measurement has been published in journals including the Journal of Sports Sciences and Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. There are also several field test protocols that don't require any specialized equipment beyond a stopwatch and a way to measure distance, which I think deserve more attention than they typically get in popular fitness content, given how accessible they are. The Cooper 12-minute run test, where you simply run as far as you possibly can in 12 minutes and plug the resulting distance into an established formula, has been used for decades as a reasonably validated, low-cost field estimate of VO₂ max citation. This Cooper test protocol and its formula-based VO₂ max estimation was originally developed and validated by Kenneth Cooper and has remained in use in exercise physiology and military fitness testing literature for decades. Similarly, various shuttle run and step test protocols exist that provide reasonable, though admittedly less precise than laboratory testing, estimates using minimal equipment, citation. These alternative field test protocols for estimating VO₂ max, including various shuttle run and step test formats, have been validated against laboratory measurement in exercise physiology literature with varying degrees of accuracy depending on the specific protocol and population tested. I mention these specifically because I think one of the most useful, concrete things you can do after watching this video, beyond simply absorbing the concepts, is actually establishing your own baseline number, however imprecise, using one of these accessible methods, and then tracking whether it improves over time as you apply the training principles we're discussing, since a trend over months is considerably more useful and actionable than a single precise number captured once and never revisited. I want to address something about normative reference ranges here as well, since I think knowing your own number is only useful if you have some sense of what it means relative to the broader population. VO₂ max naturally varies considerably by age and sex, generally declining gradually with age and tending to be somewhat higher on average in men compared to women, largely reflecting differences in average lean muscle mass, hemoglobin concentration, and heart size, citation. This pattern of VO₂ max variation by age and sex is well established in exercise physiology reference literature, with normative tables published across sports medicine and cardiopulmonary exercise testing resources. Research organizations and cardiology associations have published reference tables allowing you to compare your own measured or estimated VO₂ max against age and sex-matched population percentiles. And I think this comparison matters more than the raw absolute number in isolation, since a VO₂ max that would be considered excellent for a 70-year-old would be considered quite low for a 25-year-old. And understanding where you actually fall relative to your appropriate comparison group gives you a considerably more meaningful, actionable sense of whether you're in that lowest, highest risk category we discussed earlier, or somewhere further up the distribution where the marginal returns on further improvement, while still genuinely present, are somewhat less dramatic. Let me bring in something about the specific magnitude of improvement that's realistically achievable through training, since I think this matters for setting appropriate expectations. Research on VO₂ max trainability has generally found that most previously sedentary or moderately active individuals can expect improvements somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% over a period of several months. Consistent, appropriately structured training with the specific magnitude depending considerably on starting fitness level, genetics, age, and the specific training approach used, citation. This general range of expected VO₂ max improvement through structured training has been described across exercise physiology research examining training responses in previously untrained or moderately trained populations. I want to be honest that there's also a genuine, well-documented degree of individual variation in trainability itself, meaning some individuals show considerably larger VO₂ max improvements than others in response to an identical training stimulus, likely reflecting genuine genetic variation in trainability. A phenomenon that's been studied directly in research examining twin and family-based heritability of the VO₂ max training response, specifically as distinct from baseline VO₂ max itself, citation. This genetic variation in VO₂ max trainability, independent of baseline fitness, has been examined in research including the Heritage Family Study, published in journals including the Journal of Applied Physiology, which specifically studied VO₂ max responses to a standardized training program across family groups. I mention this not to discourage anyone, since the vast majority of people do show meaningful improvement with consistent training. But to be honest, that if you find your own progress slower than someone else following an identical program, that doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. Genuine individual variation in trainability is a real documented phenomenon. Let me now bring together everything we've discussed about training methods, specifically in service of this VO₂ max target, since I think this is where the practical value of this entire reframing really lands. Given that VO₂ max is the actual outcome the mortality data most directly implicates, and given what we now understand about how different training intensities drive different components of the physiological adaptation chain underlying VO₂ max, a well-structured approach for someone genuinely trying to maximize this specific outcome should include a foundation of consistent, moderate intensity aerobic volume, since total training volume still matters considerably for supporting broader mitochondrial and capillary adaptations throughout the muscle tissue itself, combined with a deliberate, regularly performed dose of genuinely high-intensity effort, specifically targeting the cardiac stroke volume and central cardiovascular adaptations that respond most strongly to near-maximal training stimulus. In practical terms, this might look like 3 to 4 sessions weekly of steady, moderate-intensity aerobic work, the conversational pace effort we've discussed in previous videos, combined with 1 to 2 sessions weekly, specifically structured around intervals performed close to your actual maximal effort, something in the range of 4 to 6 rounds of hard effort lasting 2 to 4 minutes each, with adequate recovery between rounds, citation. Various specific interval protocols targeting VO₂ max improvement have been studied with broadly similar effectiveness across formats, discussed in sports medicine reviews on interval training protocol design for cardiorespiratory fitness improvement. I want to reiterate something I've said in previous videos because it remains genuinely important here. If you're currently sedentary or have known cardiovascular risk factors, the appropriate starting point isn't jumping straight into maximal effort intervals. It's building a consistent base of lower intensity activity first, ideally with medical clearance, if relevant risk factors are present, and progressing toward higher intensity work gradually once that foundation is established. Citation: this graduated approach to introducing higher intensity exercise, particularly in previously sedentary or at-risk populations, is standard guidance in cardiac rehabilitation and exercise prescription literature. I want to address something about resistance training's relationship to VO₂ max, specifically here as well, since I think this connects our previous conversations on strength and longevity to this specific conversation in a way I haven't fully articulated before. Resistance training alone, without a dedicated aerobic component, generally produces relatively modest improvements in VO₂ max, specifically compared to dedicated aerobic and interval training, though it's not entirely without effect, particularly in previously untrained individuals. Citation: this relatively modest but non-zero effect of resistance training alone on VO₂ max improvement has been examined in exercise physiology research comparing training modality effects on cardiorespiratory fitness outcomes. This is genuinely important context because it means the muscular strength and functional reserve capacity conversation we've had extensively in previous videos, and the cardiorespiratory fitness and VO₂ max conversation we're having today represent genuinely distinct complementary pathways to reduced mortality risk, rather than one being a substitute for the other. You need both a dedicated aerobic training component, ideally including the interval work we've discussed, specifically to drive VO2 max improvement, and a dedicated resistance training component, specifically to drive the muscular strength and functional reserve benefits we've covered before. And neither adequately substitutes for what the other specifically provides. Let me talk about something I think deserves genuine, direct attention now, which is what actually happens to VO2 max as we age, and what the research says about how modifiable this age-related decline genuinely is, because I think this connects directly to the broader theme of agency and actionability that's run through this entire video series. VO2 max does naturally decline with age, generally beginning somewhere around the third decade of life and progressing at an accelerating rate in later decades, largely reflecting age-related declines across the same physiological systems we discussed earlier: reduced maximal heart rate, reduced stroke volume, some degree of muscle mass and mitochondrial density loss. Citation. This pattern of age-related VO2 max decline has been documented extensively in longitudinal exercise physiology research, examining cardiorespiratory fitness trajectories across the adult lifespan. However, and this is genuinely the more important, more actionable piece of this specific finding, research comparing habitually active older adults against sedentary peers of the same age has consistently found that the rate of this age-related decline is substantially blunted in individuals who maintain consistent aerobic training throughout their adult life, meaning a genuinely active 70-year-old can, and often does, maintain a VO2 max considerably higher than a sedentary 50-year-old, despite the 20-year age difference. Citation. This substantial difference in VO2 max decline trajectory between habitually active and sedentary aging populations has been examined in longitudinal and cross-sectional exercise physiology research on masters athletes aging, published in journals including the Journal of Applied Physiology. This is genuinely one of the more encouraging, practically important findings in this entire body of research, and I think it deserves to be stated plainly. The age-related decline in VO2 max that most people simply accept as an inevitable, unstoppable consequence of getting older is, to a substantial degree, actually a consequence of declining activity levels that tend to accompany aging in most modern populations, rather than age itself being an independent, unstoppable driver of decline to nearly the degree most people assume. This mirrors something we discussed in a previous video regarding basal metabolic rate and age, where more rigorous research revised the common assumption of an inevitable, steady metabolic slowdown throughout adulthood. And I think a similar correction applies here. A meaningful portion of what gets attributed purely to aging is actually attributable to the behavioral changes, reduced activity, reduced training intensity, that commonly but not inevitably accompany aging and which remain genuinely within your control to a considerably greater degree than most people assume. I want to bring in the concept of masters athletes here specifically, since I think this population offers some of the most compelling, direct evidence for just how much of the assumed inevitable age-related decline is actually modifiable through consistent high-level training. Research studying competitive masters athletes, meaning older adults who have continued training at a genuinely high level well into their 60s, 70s, and beyond, has found VO2 max values in these individuals dramatically exceeding population norms for their age, in some cases approaching or exceeding values typical of sedentary individuals decades younger. Citation. This research documenting exceptional cardiorespiratory fitness preservation in aging masters athletes has been published in exercise physiology and sports medicine literature, examining elite aging athlete populations. I don't want to overstate this by suggesting everyone can or should aim for the extreme end of what dedicated, lifelong competitive masters athletes achieve. That level of commitment isn't realistic or even necessarily desirable for most people. But I think this research is genuinely important as a demonstration of the upper bound of what's physiologically possible with consistent, dedicated training across the lifespan. And it should meaningfully shift how fatalistically you think about age-related cardiorespiratory decline being simply an unavoidable consequence of the years passing. If any of this is resonating with you, and you want the complete structured framework for actually testing and tracking your own VO2 max over time, calibrating your training intensity distribution appropriately, and understanding exactly where you fall relative to age and sex-matched population norms, that's exactly the kind of practical, organized material I've put together across the ebooks linked in the description below. I built them specifically so you'd have a genuine, structured reference to work from rather than trying to reconstruct a complete system from pieces scattered across individual videos. So if this entire longevity and cardiorespiratory fitness conversation has genuinely resonated with you across this series, I'd really encourage you to go check them out. Let me address something about sex differences in VO2 max and cardiorespiratory fitness research specifically here, since I think this is a genuinely important and somewhat underdiscussed piece of the broader picture. Women on average have somewhat lower absolute VO2 max values than men, largely reflecting differences in average heart size, hemoglobin concentration, and lean muscle mass citation. This pattern of average sex differences in VO2 max has been established extensively in exercise physiology reference literature. However, when VO2 max is examined relative to age and sex match norms, meaning comparing a woman's fitness to other women of her age rather than to men generally, the same fundamental relationship between fitness category and mortality risk appears to hold. Citation, this consistent relationship between relative age and sex-adjusted cardiorespiratory fitness and mortality risk across both men and women has been examined in cardiopulmonary exercise testing research published in Mayo Clinic Proceedings and Related Cardiology literature. I mention this because I think it's important to be clear that this entire conversation applies meaningfully to everyone. The specific absolute numbers you're comparing yourself against should be appropriately adjusted for your own age and sex, but the underlying principle that your relative position within your own appropriate comparison group carries substantial, well-documented predictive weight for your long-term health holds broadly across the population. I want to spend some time now addressing menopause specifically, since this represents a period of life where cardiovascular risk profiles shift meaningfully for women. And I think it's directly relevant to this VO2 max conversation. The hormonal changes associated with menopause are associated with less favorable shifts in several cardiovascular risk markers. And some research has specifically examined cardiorespiratory fitness trajectories through this transition, finding that VO2 max decline may accelerate somewhat during and after the menopausal transition, independent of chronological age alone. Citation, this research on VO2 max and cardiovascular risk marker changes specifically associated with the menopausal transition has been published in journals including Menopause and the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. This is genuinely useful context for women navigating this specific life stage, since it suggests that maintaining, or in some cases increasing, dedicated cardiorespiratory training, specifically during and after this transition, may carry particular value, given this accelerated risk profile shift, rather than assuming the same training approach that worked in earlier decades will automatically continue producing the same protective effect without any need for adjustment. Let me talk now about something that I think connects this entire VO2 max conversation back to the broader theme we've built across this whole video series, which is how VO2 max interacts with and is influenced by sleep, stress, and recovery, the same recovery-focused variables we've discussed extensively in previous videos on strength training and body composition. VO2 max testing and training adaptation both depend on your body's capacity to actually recover and adapt to the training stimulus you're providing. And chronic sleep deprivation and unmanaged stress have both been associated with blunted training adaptations across multiple physiological systems, including some research specifically examining reduced cardiorespiratory fitness gains in individuals experiencing chronic sleep restriction during a structured training intervention, compared to adequately rested individuals following the identical training program. Citation, this relationship between sleep quality and the magnitude of cardiorespiratory fitness adaptation to training has been examined in exercise physiology research on sleep and training response, published in journals including the Journal of Sports Sciences. This reinforces something we've returned to repeatedly across this video series. The specific training method you choose, however carefully optimized, doesn't operate in isolation from the rest of your life, and neglecting sleep and stress management can genuinely undermine even a well-designed training approach, specifically targeting VO2 max improvement. I want to address something about the relationship between VO2 max and specific disease states more directly now, since I think understanding the mechanistic connections makes the mortality statistics we open this video with considerably more concrete and less abstract. Higher VO2 max has been associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, specifically, which makes intuitive sense given everything we've discussed about the cardiac and vascular adaptations underlying VO2 max improvement. But the relationship extends considerably further than cardiovascular disease alone. Research has found associations between higher cardiorespiratory fitness and reduced risk of several cancers, including colorectal and, in some research, breast cancer, with proposed mechanisms including reduced chronic inflammation, improved insulin sensitivity, and more favorable hormone regulation associated with higher fitness levels. Citation: this relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness and reduced cancer risk across several cancer types has been examined in epidemiological research published in journals including the British Journal of Sports Medicine and the Journal of the National Cancer Institute. Higher cardiorespiratory fitness has also been associated with reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, reduced risk of several forms of dementia and cognitive decline, and improved outcomes and recovery following major surgery. Citation: this broad range of associations between cardiorespiratory fitness and reduced risk across multiple, seemingly unrelated disease categories has been examined across a substantial body of epidemiological and clinical research. Summarized in reviews on cardiorespiratory fitness as a vital sign published in journals including Progress in Cardiovascular Diseases. This breadth of association is really, I think, the clearest demonstration of why VO2 max functions as such a powerful integrated marker. It isn't simply reflecting your cardiovascular health narrowly defined. It appears to reflect something closer to your overall systemic physiological resilience, touching on inflammation, metabolic health, and cellular function broadly, well beyond the cardiovascular system in isolation. I want to bring in something specifically about surgical outcomes here, since I think it's a genuinely compelling, concrete illustration of the functional reserve capacity concept we've discussed in previous videos, now specifically applied to cardiorespiratory fitness. Preoperative cardiopulmonary exercise testing, essentially measuring a patient's VO2 max before a major surgery, has become an increasingly used tool in some surgical specialties, specifically because lower preoperative VO2 max has been consistently associated with higher rates of postoperative complications and longer hospital recovery times. Citation: this use of preoperative cardiopulmonary exercise testing and its association with surgical outcomes has been examined in perioperative medicine research published in journals including the British Journal of Anesthesia and Analgesia. This is genuinely one of the more direct, clinically applied demonstrations of the functional reserve capacity concept. A patient's measured maximal oxygen delivery and utilization capacity, tested before they ever undergo the physiological stress of major surgery, meaningfully predicts how well they'll tolerate and recover from that stress. Precisely the kind of reserve capacity relationship we've discussed throughout this entire video series, just now demonstrated in a specific, immediately actionable clinical context. Let me address something practical about how VO2 max testing and training fits into a broader health monitoring approach, since I think this connects usefully to some of what we discussed in a previous video about simple, accessible longevity tests. Just as grip strength, the sitting rising test, and single leg balance offer accessible, low-cost windows into muscular strength and functional capacity, the field testing methods we discussed earlier in this video, the Cooper test and similar protocols, offer a genuinely accessible, no-cost or low-cost window into your cardiorespiratory capacity specifically. I think a genuinely comprehensive, evidence-based approach to monitoring your own longevity-relevant fitness markers would include both categories: periodic testing of muscular strength and functional capacity, alongside periodic testing or estimation of your cardiorespiratory fitness, since these represent genuinely distinct complementary physiological systems, both independently powerfully predictive of long-term outcomes, and neither one alone gives you the complete picture that testing both together provides. I want to close out the research-heavy portion of this video by returning to and updating the framework I've offered in previous videos on this topic, now properly centered around VO2 max as the actual target outcome, rather than any specific training method being debated as an end in itself. The evidence-based approach to cardiorespiratory training, if your goal is genuinely maximizing the specific outcome that the mortality research most directly and most powerfully implicates, involves a consistent base of moderate intensity aerobic training, providing the volume needed to support broad mitochondrial and capillary adaptations throughout your muscle tissue, combined with a regular, deliberate dose of genuinely high-intensity interval work, specifically targeting the cardiac and central adaptations that respond most strongly to near maximal effort, appropriately progressed and medically cleared if you're coming from a sedentary or at-risk starting point. This should be combined with, not substituted by, a dedicated resistance training program, given that muscular strength and VO2 max represent genuinely distinct pathways to reduced mortality risk that don't substitute for each other. And ideally, this entire approach should be periodically checked against some form of actual measurement or field test estimation of your own VO2 max, rather than assuming your training is producing the improvement you're hoping for without ever actually verifying it against your own tracked numbers over time. Let me bring this entire considerably long conversation together now into what I actually want you to walk away with. I've spent previous videos in this series correcting myself on specific pieces of the cardio conversation, whether Zone 2 deserved the singular emphasis I once gave it, whether strength matters more than I initially credited. What I want this video to add, the piece I think I've been circling without ever fully naming, is that underneath all of those specific training method debates sits a single integrated, remarkably powerful outcome measure, your VO2 max, your body's actual measured ceiling for taking in and using oxygen, that the mortality research points to again and again as one of the most powerful predictors we have of how long you'll live and how well you'll function while you're alive. This number reflects the combined health of your heart, your lungs, your blood, your vasculature, and your muscle tissue's cellular machinery operating together at their absolute limit, which is precisely why it captures so much information that narrower single system markers simply can't. The specific training method you use to improve it, Zone 2, intervals, some polarized combination of both, matters, but it matters as a means to that end, not as an end unto itself. And I think reframing the entire conversation around this actual target rather than around competing training philosophies treated as though they were the ultimate goal is genuinely the correction I most needed to make, and the one I hope changes how you think about your own cardiovascular training going forward. If you want the complete structured system for testing your own VO2 max using accessible field methods, understanding exactly where you fall relative to appropriate age and sex norms, and building a training approach specifically designed to move that number in the right direction over time, all of that is laid out in considerably more depth in the ebooks I've linked in the description below. If you've made it this far into this video, and honestly into this entire series of corrections and updates I've walked you through, you clearly care about getting this right rather than settling for whatever oversimplified version of cardio advice happens to be trending at any given moment. So go take a look. It's exactly the kind of resource built to help you take everything we've covered across these videos and turn it into a genuine, trackable, evidence-based training approach you can actually follow for the rest of your life, not just for the next few months. There's more I want to add here because I don't think I've done this topic justice yet, and I want to go considerably deeper into pieces I only touched on briefly. Let me talk about the specific interval protocols that have been most rigorously studied for VO2 max improvement, because I think the practical prescription deserves more precision than I've given it so far. Norwegian researchers have studied a protocol involving 4 rounds of 4 minutes at roughly 90 to 95% of maximal heart rate, separated by 3 minutes of active recovery, extensively over more than 2 decades. And this specific protocol, sometimes called 4x4 training, has produced some of the most consistently replicated VO2 max improvements in the entire exercise science literature, including in clinical populations with existing cardiovascular disease, where it's been found not only effective, but genuinely safe under appropriate medical supervision, citation, this 4x4 interval protocol, and its extensive validation across both healthy and cardiac patient populations has been studied by researchers including Ulrich Wisloff and colleagues, published in journals including Circulation and the Journal of the American Heart Association. I want to highlight this specific point about cardiac patients because I think it's genuinely striking. This isn't simply a protocol for already healthy people looking to optimize at the margins. It's been studied and found beneficial under proper supervision in people who've already had heart failure or a heart attack, which tells you something meaningful about how robust and broadly applicable this kind of training stimulus actually is when appropriately dosed and supervised. Another well-studied approach uses considerably shorter, more intense efforts, something like 30 seconds at genuinely maximal all-out effort, followed by 4 minutes of easy recovery, repeated for 4 to 6 rounds, sometimes called sprint interval training. And research has found this can produce VO2 max improvements comparable to considerably higher volumes of moderate intensity training, despite the total time spent in the hard efforts themselves being remarkably small, often just a few minutes of genuinely maximal effort spread across an entire session, citation. This sprint interval training protocol and its time-efficient VO2 max benefits have been studied extensively by researchers, including Martin Gibala, published in journals including the Journal of Physiology. I find this particular body of research genuinely important for anyone who's told me over the years that they simply don't have time for structured cardio training because it directly challenges that assumption. The actual hard effort time investment required to meaningfully move your VO2 max needle is considerably smaller than most people assume, even if the psychological and physical intensity of those brief efforts is genuinely demanding. I want to address something about individualizing interval intensity here, since I think prescribing a percentage of maximal heart rate without addressing how to actually determine that number leaves a practical gap. Age-predicted maximal heart rate formulas, the commonly cited 220 minus your age calculation, carry a surprisingly large individual error margin, sometimes off by 15 to 20 beats per minute in either direction for a given individual. Citation, this meaningful inaccuracy of age-predicted maximal heart rate formulas at the individual level has been examined in cardiovascular exercise physiology research, including work by Tanaka and colleagues proposing revised formulas that still carry meaningful individual variation despite improving on the original estimate. This means that prescribing interval intensity purely off an age-based formula risks either underdosing someone whose true maximum is considerably higher than the formula predicts, or overdosing someone whose true maximum is considerably lower. A more individually accurate approach, when accessible, involves either a supervised maximal exercise test to directly determine your actual maximum heart rate, or, more practically for most people, using perceived exertion as a cross-check alongside heart rate, where genuinely hard interval efforts should feel like something you could sustain for perhaps another minute or two at most if pushed, rather than relying purely on hitting a specific numerical heart rate target derived from an imprecise formula. Let me bring in respiratory muscle training here as well, since this is a piece of the VO2 max puzzle that gets almost no attention in popular fitness content, despite a genuine, if more modest, evidence base supporting it. The muscles involved in breathing, primarily the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles between your ribs, can themselves become a limiting factor in oxygen delivery during intense exercise, particularly in some individuals, and specific inspiratory muscle training using a handheld resistance device that you breathe against for a period of minutes daily has been shown in some research to produce modest improvements in exercise performance and, in some studies, contribute to overall cardiorespiratory fitness markers. Citation, this research on inspiratory muscle training and its effects on exercise performance has been examined in sports medicine literature, though I want to be honest that the magnitude of benefit specifically for VO2 max itself, as opposed to broader exercise tolerance and perceived breathing effort, remains a more modest and less definitively established effect compared to the aerobic and interval training we've spent most of this video discussing. This isn't something I'd recommend prioritizing over the core aerobic and interval training we've covered, but for someone who has already established a solid training foundation and is looking for additional, smaller marginal gains, it represents a genuinely evidence-supported, if secondary, tool worth knowing about. I want to address altitude and hypoxic training here too, since it's a topic that comes up constantly in endurance and longevity circles, and I think it deserves honest treatment regarding both its genuine benefits and its practical limitations for the average person. Training or living at moderate altitude or using simulated altitude through hypoxic tents or masks has been shown to produce beneficial adaptations, including increased red blood cell production and improved oxygen carrying capacity, which can translate to meaningful VO₂ max and performance benefits, particularly for athletes specifically preparing to compete at altitude. Citation: this altitude training research and its physiological mechanisms have been studied extensively in exercise physiology literature on hypoxic training adaptations. However, for the general population simply trying to improve health-relevant VO₂ max at sea level, the practical accessibility and cost of genuine altitude training or properly implemented simulated altitude protocols makes this a considerably less relevant tool than the sea level interval and moderate intensity training. We've spent most of this video discussing, and I don't want to give the impression that altitude exposure represents some kind of necessary or even particularly high value addition for the average person's longevity-focused training approach. It's a genuinely interesting but largely niche consideration relative to everything else we've covered. Let me talk about heat and its relationship to cardiovascular adaptation, since this connects to a training modality that's received considerable popular attention recently. Regular heat exposure, whether through training in hot conditions or through passive heat exposure like sauna use, has been associated in some research with cardiovascular adaptations that overlap meaningfully with those produced by aerobic exercise itself, including improvements in plasma volume and some markers of cardiovascular function. Citation: this research on heat exposure and cardiovascular adaptation has been examined in studies published in the Journal of Applied Physiology and related exercise and thermal physiology literature, particularly research on sauna use and cardiovascular outcomes conducted in Finnish population cohorts. I want to be careful here about the strength of the causal claim, since a substantial portion of this specific evidence base, particularly research on regular sauna use and long-term cardiovascular outcomes, comes from observational cohort studies rather than tightly controlled randomized trials specifically isolating heat exposure as an independent variable separate from the broader lifestyle and socioeconomic factors that might correlate with regular sauna use in the population studied. Citation needed for a comprehensive body of randomized controlled trial evidence specifically isolating heat exposure's independent causal contribution to VO₂ max improvement, separate from broader lifestyle factors. Since much of the strongest population level evidence in this specific area remains observational rather than experimental. This doesn't mean heat exposure is without genuine value, and I think it's a reasonable complementary practice for people who enjoy it and have access to it. But I don't think the current evidence supports treating it as a substitute for the core aerobic and interval training we've discussed throughout this video, more as a potentially useful lower certainty addition on top of that foundation. I want to spend real time now on the relationship between air pollution and VO₂ max, since I think this represents a genuinely under-discussed environmental factor relevant to this entire conversation. Chronic exposure to air pollution, particularly fine particulate matter, has been associated in research with both acute and chronic reductions in lung function and cardiorespiratory fitness through mechanisms including airway inflammation and reduced efficiency of oxygen exchange at the alveolar level. Citation: this relationship between chronic air pollution exposure and reduced cardiorespiratory fitness and lung function has been examined in environmental and respiratory epidemiology research published in journals including the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine. I raise this because I think it's a genuinely important, if somewhat uncomfortable, piece of context for anyone doing intense outdoor training in areas with meaningful air pollution. And it's worth being aware of local air quality conditions, particularly on high pollution days, when deciding whether to perform genuinely intense outdoor interval training, since the acute respiratory stress of pushing toward maximal effort in poor air quality conditions may partially offset some of the cardiorespiratory benefit you're trying to achieve, and indoor training alternatives are worth considering on days with particularly poor air quality where you have access to them. Let me address medications and their effects on VO2 max and exercise capacity, since this is genuinely relevant for a meaningful portion of the audience watching this, particularly given how common certain medication classes are. Beta blockers, commonly prescribed for various cardiovascular conditions and for anxiety, work by blunting heart rate response, which directly affects both your ability to reach genuinely high heart rates during interval training and, to some degree, the specific numerical VO2 max value you'll measure or estimate without necessarily reflecting a genuine decline in your underlying cardiovascular fitness or health citation. This effect of beta blocker medication on heart rate response and its implications for exercise testing and prescription has been discussed extensively in cardiac rehabilitation and clinical exercise physiology literature. This is genuinely important practical context. If you're on a beta blocker or another medication that affects heart rate response, both your training intensity, prescription, since heart rate-based intensity zones become considerably less reliable, and your interpretation of any VO2 max testing or estimation you undergo need to account for this, ideally with guidance from your prescribing physician or a qualified exercise professional familiar with your specific medication regimen, rather than applying the generic heart rate-based guidance we've discussed throughout this video without this important adjustment. I want to bring in something about statins here as well, since this is another extremely commonly prescribed medication class relevant to cardiovascular health broadly. And there's a genuinely interesting, somewhat underappreciated research thread connecting it to exercise capacity. Specifically, some research has found that statin use is associated with modestly reduced improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness in response to exercise training, compared to similar training programs in individuals not taking statins, with proposed mechanisms including statins' effects on mitochondrial function within skeletal muscle, citation. This research on statin use and blunted cardiorespiratory fitness training response has been examined in studies published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology and related cardiovascular pharmacology and exercise physiology literature. I want to be genuinely careful and balanced here, since statins carry substantial, well-established cardiovascular benefit for appropriate patients, and I am absolutely not suggesting anyone should discontinue a prescribed statin based on this research without a direct conversation with their physician. But I think it's honest and useful context that if you're on a statin and find your cardiorespiratory fitness improving somewhat more slowly than the general research we've discussed throughout this video would predict, this represents a genuine, documented factor that may be contributing rather than necessarily reflecting some failure in your training approach itself. Let me return to the epidemiological picture now and add some additional depth to the disease-specific associations I touched on earlier, because I think this deserves more thorough treatment beyond cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and dementia, which I mentioned earlier. Research has also found associations between higher cardiorespiratory fitness and better outcomes across a range of other conditions, including reduced severity of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease symptoms and exacerbations in patients who maintain higher fitness levels despite their underlying lung disease, improved outcomes and reduced hospitalization risk in patients with existing heart failure who undergo structured cardiorespiratory fitness training as part of cardiac rehabilitation, and even associations with better mental health outcomes, including reduced rates of depression and anxiety, independent of the specific antidepressant effects of exercise itself that we've discussed in previous videos. Citation. This broad range of disease-specific associations between cardiorespiratory fitness and improved outcomes has been examined across multiple specialty literatures, including pulmonology research on COPD and exercise capacity, cardiology research on heart failure rehabilitation outcomes, and psychiatric research on cardiorespiratory fitness and mental health, published across journals including the European Respiratory Journal, Circulation, Heart Failure, and JAMA Psychiatry. I want to spend time now specifically on cardiorespiratory fitness as what's increasingly being called a vital sign in clinical medicine, since I think this framing genuinely captures something important about where this field is heading and connects back to why I think this entire video represents such an important correction to how I've previously discussed cardio. The American Heart Association published a formal scientific statement specifically advocating for cardiorespiratory fitness to be routinely assessed in clinical practice alongside traditional vital signs like blood pressure, heart rate, and temperature, given the strength and consistency of its association with long-term health outcomes across the range of conditions we've now discussed extensively. Citation: American Heart Association scientific statement on cardiorespiratory fitness as a clinical vital sign, published in Circulation. This is a genuinely significant institutional acknowledgement coming from one of the most influential cardiovascular medical organizations in the world, that this specific measurement deserves a place alongside the handful of numbers doctors have traditionally checked routinely. And I think it validates the entire premise of this video that VO₂ max deserves considerably more attention and routine consideration than it currently receives in most people's own personal health tracking, let alone in standard clinical practice, where routine measurement still remains far from universal despite this formal recommendation. Let me address something about wearable device VO₂. Max estimation with a bit more depth than I gave it earlier, since I think the specific algorithmic approaches different devices use genuinely matter for how much confidence to place in the numbers they produce. Most consumer wearables estimate VO₂ max using what's called a submaximal prediction model, essentially extrapolating from your heart rate response during moderate, non-maximal exercise, combined with your pace or power output, rather than requiring you to actually push to genuine exhaustion the way a true laboratory test does. Citation: this submaximal algorithm-based approach used by most consumer wearable VO₂ max estimation features has been described in technical validation literature examining specific device algorithms published in sports technology and exercise physiology journals. This extrapolation approach is genuinely clever and reasonably useful for tracking trends over time, but it depends heavily on the quality and consistency of the underlying data feeding into it, meaning factors like inconsistent GPS accuracy during outdoor runs, inconsistent heart rate strap or optical sensor accuracy, and simple day-to-day variation in effort and conditions can all introduce meaningful noise into any single reading, which is precisely why I'd encourage treating any single wearable estimated VO₂ max reading with real caution while treating the trend across many weeks and months of consistent measurement as considerably more informative and trustworthy. I want to bring in doubly labeled water research here again, but specifically as it relates to VO₂ max and total energy expenditure together, since I think this connects usefully to the metabolism conversation we had in a previous video. Doubly labeled water, the gold standard method for measuring total daily energy expenditure that we discussed in that earlier video, and direct VO₂ max testing measure genuinely different things. One captures your total daily caloric burn across all activities. The other captures your maximal oxygen utilization capacity, specifically during peak effort. And research combining both measurements in the same individuals has found that they're correlated but distinct, meaning someone can have a relatively high daily energy expenditure through substantial NEAT and general activity without necessarily having a particularly high VO₂ max, and vice versa. Citation: this relationship and distinction between total daily energy expenditure and maximal cardiorespiratory capacity has been examined in research combining doubly labeled water and cardiopulmonary exercise testing methodologies. I mention this because I think it's genuinely useful to understand that the NEAT and daily movement conversation from our metabolism video and the VO₂ max conversation from this video represent two distinct complementary pieces of a complete picture, rather than one simply being a proxy for the other. Both matter and both deserve independent attention, rather than assuming that being generally active throughout your day automatically means your VO₂ max specifically is also where it should be. Let me bring this considerably expanded, more thorough version of this conversation to its actual close now. Everything we've covered across this video, the 4x4 and sprint interval protocols specifically studied for VO2 max improvement, the genuine but more modest role of respiratory muscle training, the honest limitations and niche applicability of altitude and heat exposure for the average person's practical training, the environmental factor of air pollution that deserves more attention than it typically gets, the important medication considerations around beta blockers and statins that can meaningfully affect both your training prescription and your interpretation of your own numbers, the broad, genuinely striking range of disease associations extending well beyond cardiovascular disease alone, and the formal clinical recognition of cardiorespiratory fitness as a vital sign deserving routine measurement. All of it points back to the same central correction I opened this video with. VO2 max is not simply one variable among many in the cardio training conversation. It's the actual integrated outcome that the mortality and disease research most directly and most consistently implicates across a genuinely remarkable range of seemingly unrelated health domains. And I think treating it as the central measurable target of your cardiorespiratory training, rather than getting lost purely in debates about which specific training method or protocol is theoretically superior, is the correction that actually matters most. If you want the complete structured system for testing your own VO2 max using accessible field methods, interpreting your results against appropriate age and sex norms, adjusting appropriately if you're on medications that affect heart rate response, and building a genuinely comprehensive training approach that addresses VO2 max, muscular strength, and the broader recovery factors we've discussed across sleep and stress management in previous videos. All of that is laid out in considerably more depth in the ebooks I've linked in the description below. If you've made it this far into this considerably long, detailed video, you clearly want the complete picture rather than a superficial summary. So go take a look. It's exactly the kind of resource built to help you take everything we've covered across this entire series and turn it into a genuine, evidence-based, trackable approach to your long-term health. This video discusses general exercise and health research for informational purposes only and does not constitute personalized medical advice. If you have existing health conditions, cardiovascular risk factors, are taking medications that affect heart rate or exercise response, or are new to structured exercise, particularly before beginning any higher intensity training or undergoing any form of maximal or near maximal exercise testing, consult a qualified physician for appropriate screening and clearance, and consider working with a qualified exercise professional to ensure safe progression, particularly if you are returning to exercise after a significant period of inactivity or have underlying cardiovascular concerns.